So nice to meet you. Good. All right. So, a couple of announcements. We are not going to have a meeting in December because so many people are away. Although the fact that we're on Zoom means that if you're away, you can still access the meeting. That's one thing. The other thing is, because of Barbara's and Alana's help, this is always recorded. And I've had a lot of feedback from a number of people that if they can't come, they can still watch it. So I've decided that we're going to keep this available on Zoom for the foreseeable future. I've looked at a lot of other places for us to meet. And there are some interesting places. And the best part about the community center where we used to meet was when we brought, food for the pantry and knew what was going on there, but it just isn't feasible to do that at the Lucia Center anymore. And that is the last thing I want to mention is, please, everybody, be aware of the community centers in your various neighborhoods. They are the place that supports the people that are your neighbors and who possibly aren't as fortunate as we are, and where people can go to get help, assistance, advice, a range of things. So look for your community centers. We've had over the years a number of directors of community centers speak to us, and we know the wonderful work they do. So find out where they are and get in touch with them. I know many of you already do. So I would like to introduce Angela Fitzgerald. And Angela, I'm going to talk about all of the things you do, but I want to introduce you by telling a story that happened to me last week. I'm currently, I don't know why I did this, but I'm currently working at Von Maur in the customer service department. So a lot of people come up to have gifts wrapped or to ask questions or pay bills or what have you. This man walked up and he was a person of color. He walked up to me and he said, I just want to compliment this store. He said, I've had the most wonderful experience. Now, people say that, okay. But then he went on and he said, I walked into the store and I was waited on immediately. Somebody came up and said, what can I do for you today? He said, do you know how unusual that is? And it took me aback for a moment. And then I looked at him and I realized why it was unusual. We all have heard these stories, and Angela, you know them as well and may have lived them, that especially Black men who walk into a store are not treated like customers. They're treated as if they're thugs. I mean, that's and the store has already had a lot of thievery from groups of people who come in, and not always Black, not always people of color, but those are the people that are looked at first by security. So with that, Angela, I'm going to introduce you as the host of Why Race Matters on public television. But the dichotomy is that although you host that show, you also host Life in Wisconsin, right? So now we've got, I think, two things to look at. You have both ends. You get to talk about race and you get to talk about the wonderful state and city that we live in. So you're on, and any of us will interrupt you and ask questions. And of course, we're going to ask you questions about being on TV because everybody wants to know what it's like to be a celebrity. So please join us, Angela. Angela Fitzgerald.
Wow. Thank you for the introduction, Pat. And it's very nice to meet virtually all of you. I hope you're having a good Tuesday, even though it's a little bit dreary outside at the moment. But as Pat mentioned, my name is Angela Fitzgerald. Well, my TV name is Angela Fitzgerald, which is technically my maiden name. My actual name is Angela Fitzgerald Ward. I got married about 5 years ago. And I've been a Wisconsin resident now for 8 years. And so I'm originally from the East Coast. I grew up outside of Washington, D.C., in a part of the country that if you're from there, we refer to it as the DMV. Now, I recognize that folks outside that area think Department of Motor Vehicles. For us, DMV means that DC, Maryland, and Virginia all kind of touch. So it's that area where you can hop around to those three state/city in a very short period of time. So that's what I was used to growing up. So I lived in that area up until 17, then kind of went to college, not too far away, closer to Baltimore and Baltimore County. And then for grad school, I moved to Richmond, Virginia, and lived there for 10 years before moving here. So I spent most of my life in the East Coast / South before transitioning and becoming a Midwesterner. And it has absolutely been a culture shock in a way that I did not anticipate. So that very much has fed into the work that I do with Wisconsin Life and with now Why Race Matters, and even the work I do outside of PBS Wisconsin is bringing the perspective of someone from an underrepresented group, a historically marginalized group, and particularly more so in our state, but originating from a space where that wasn't the case in the same way. My county is Prince George's County, and it is typically, if you look up like best places to live for like Black families, young Black professionals, like where I'm from routinely pops up on that list. And so when it comes to people like me, young Black professionals, those who look like me, they're doing well, I was accustomed to that. That wasn't an anomaly for me. So it was very eye-opening when I moved here, and that wasn't, not that it wasn't the case, like I don't want to negate that there absolutely are amazing people from communities of color here doing things, but the visibility wasn't as heightened as what I was used to. And when I say that, it's something that I think is not understood unless you've lived it. Like even my partner, when he came home with me to visit my family, he experienced culture shock in the reverse, where he wasn't used to seeing people that looked like him in the airport, people that look like him in like a medical setting. Like there are just spaces where I was used to seeing myself reflected back at me, that when I moved to Madison, I'm going to Target and I'm like, wow, I'm like the only one in this particular part of the store. And then what that means in terms of access to resources, access to services, even things like hair products and food items that I'm used to just being able to go to a store and easily be able to purchase. Now I'm like having to get creative about how do I access these things, because I can't guarantee that I'll be able to go to a store and find exactly what I need, because this store isn't set up to directly engage someone like me as compared to in another part of the country, like I said, where I'm from. So it's been very, very eye-opening. And I think what added to that was when I moved here, it was the release of it was 2014. And so the Race to Equity report had just come out. And so there was a lot of activity around that report, which I thought was kind of interesting. So I was like, okay, I'm not used to seeing this side of like so much conversation and community engagement around race. Like, let me go check these events out. So I was new to the city, just kind of want to feel out like, what is Madison? What are we about? Where do I go and find my place in the city? And so I appreciated being in settings where we were having conversations, kind of like what we're having now, where the report was being discussed. The community was able to weigh in on solutions and kind of what this means now that we are made aware of these findings. And so there was the initial like, oh, this is exciting to me. But over time, I did come to question the authenticity of the response, because it felt like,
gotta say it. We sure talk the talk, but how about people walking the walk, huh?
Right, and that's, I mean, on the one hand, like I said, it's exciting that the talk is even out there. So I commend that the conversation is happening, because there are spaces where it's not happening at all. But it's another thing when the conversation keeps happening, but it doesn't feel like there's actual change following behind the conversation. Right, and so that's, I think, a space that Madison can sometimes find itself in. And I get that change takes time, like, because we're talking about deeply rooted historic systemic issues that aren't going to change overnight. So there's evidence that like, okay, we're moving the needle, we're trying to progress, but at the same time, for communities that have been long impacted, that have been here, right? They're not new to Madison like me, they're not new to Wisconsin like me. I also understand the frustration, as well as the disconnection from any sense of excitement, because to some groups, it's like, well, we've been here, done that, we keep talking about things, but what's actually changing, right? And so I find myself kind of in the middle of that, in which I still have a sense of optimism because I'm new, but at the same time, I do agree with, we need accountability around real change, and accountability that's not just established by those who possess power, but by those who are also being impacted by whatever change we're saying we're going to enact. Because if those individuals, if those groups aren't seeing any change, then we can't pat ourselves on the back to say that we actually did something meaningful. And so that's what I am trying to get at with the work I do across the board, but especially with PBS Wisconsin's Why Race Matters, really trying to get at how do we have meaningful conversations that do provoke some aspect of social change that is felt by the communities who need it the most. The idea for Why Race Matters came about in the summer of, I want to say 2020, is it 2019 or 2020? I'm forgetting the exact date, but it was in the height of the pandemic. And it was right around the time of George Floyd's murder. And there was this kind of shift in the tide of the larger response to the Black Lives Matter movement, because up to a point, it was like people weren't really supportive of it, so to speak. But then during that particular summer, it was interesting because now there were a lot of brands coming out with like statements around racial equity, anti-racism, white supremacy, all of that. Like these things were being talked about by like big brands, which was interesting. And again, it felt encouraging, but also created a stance of like, well, we'll wait and see what this actually means. Like, is this the new flavor of the month, or is this like really something that's going to reflect a deep commitment? And so when this was happening, I was thinking about PBS Wisconsin and wondering like, I wonder where we're situated in this conversation. Because I think it's somewhat implied that public television, has this position of being liberal and being, well, actually not really liberal, but being like neutral in a sense, but also being willing to really like tackle issues and have the hard conversations in a very educational way, because this PBS is essentially an educational platform, media platform. So I think that while yes, I think it might be assumed that this is what we feel and this is our stance, at that time, it hadn't yet been specifically articulated in the way that other brands were coming out with their statements. And so I reached out to leadership at the network and those I had worked with on Wisconsin Life about that topic, because we had kind of indirectly kind of entered that space already with Wisconsin Life, with them bringing me on as essentially the face of Wisconsin Life, being a Black woman that's actually not even a Wisconsin native, but I'm a transplant. I'm someone that when you think of Wisconsin, you might not think of me. And so I think that was slightly intentional, and that's led to some great conversation discussion around the stories that we uplift and how do we change for some people's narratives around what is Wisconsin, who makes up Wisconsin, what is cool happening in our state. And so it's been great hearing feedback from people once I kind of took on that role as host of Wisconsin Life, as well as like hearing from those who maybe had a different idea of what it would mean to have a Black host of Wisconsin Life, right? There were those who maybe had a preset idea of what that meant. And then when I came on board, that idea had to shift. So we kind of were already there in a sense, but I think that Why Race Matters allowed us to take it up a notch in that we're able to more directly address and consistently topics related to racial disparities, racial equity, the need for that within our state. So the pitch was like, how do we take what we're already doing well with Wisconsin Live, having authentic conversations with members of our community around what's taking place within our state, and connect it to this nationwide conversation that's happening around racial equity. Because at the time, we didn't have Kenosha, right? Like that hadn't happened yet. That happened like about a month or so after the idea was put out there. So it hadn't been brought stateside. And I think that some people feel as though racism is like a overt Southern thing. Like they do that over there in the ways that we recognize as racist. But here, oh no, we're Midwest nice. We don't do these things. We're liberal. Of course, we're not racist in the way that they are over there in those states. So, but people that live here would say otherwise. And then not just people, but the statistics in our state tell us otherwise. That was another element moving here to think that, wow, I come from a state, or not just a state, but I'm from a space where, like I said, I'm used to seeing myself reflected back at me very consistently in very positive ways, and sometimes in not so positive ways, but it's not this, it's not siloed in that I'm just viewed in this way. There's variety, just like there's variety of representation for any group. Whereas here, statistically, as a Black person, I'm statistically likely to do less well in life in the state of Wisconsin than a Black person in other parts of the country. compared to if I were a white person, I am more likely to do better in life in the state of Wisconsin than maybe white people in other parts of this country. So that makes me question why. Like, what is going on in the state of Wisconsin that my likelihood of succeeding, of not having certain negative outcomes attached to my livelihood, such as, the Black maternal health crisis? Like, why is it that I am at risk of having a baby in this state, which I'm still toying with the idea. I'm not sold on maternal motherhood. I'm a stepmom, but I'm like, I don't know about the biological side yet. And in part because of those statistics, like they make me nervous, like that my life, my unborn child's life could be at risk, and even more so just by virtue of me living here. Like, what is it? Why is that, right? And so again, we were trying to bring the conversation to our states that we could examine amongst ourselves, like what's going on, let's understand the issues, and then what's the responsibility for us as a collective to move the needle forward. So the idea was put out there, it was thumbs up, thankfully, and we were able to have some great conversations to start on the rooftop of the Madison Museum of Contemporary Art, because we were still social distancing and everything. So we were outside, 6 feet apart, just having dialogue around different topics related to racial equity. And those topics were cultivated through participation of an advisory that we convened, because I did not want to position myself as the sole voice of Blackness in Wisconsin. Like I said, I'm not even from Wisconsin. So that would be an error in judgment, like out the gate. So like, who are people that really have roots here and who represent different subsets of our community, of the Black community, and that can bring voice to what should we be talking about? And so we have 3 members of our advisory currently, and we're considering like where else might the gaps be in terms of voice, right? Like 3 is still not exhaustive of an entire community statewide, right? But it's a start. So we have someone who's a nonprofit leader, who's a part of our board, our advisory, Jacqueline Hunt. We have Dr. David Pate, who is a professor at UW Milwaukee, who does research around some of these topics. And then we have a young man who born and raised here, and who was oh my goodness, I think it was first wave scholar at UW named Solomon Roller. So the 3 of them bring diverse perspectives that have helped to generate our listing of topics, as well as our speakers that we wanted to talk to. Because that was another thing we were trying to be sensitive to, is diversity in voice in terms of who's being interviewed, because sometimes the same people are tapped from different groups to talk about things. And after a while, we're like, well, that's great. You have great contributions. We've heard from you already. Who have we not talked to that might bring a different perspective? So we try to do that as well. So, I mean, it's been a great experience. We're now midway through season 2. We were able to switch things up a bit because we've loosened up COVID restrictions. So we were able to bring the production inside of a studio, which was great. Got a whole set up, which was new for me, because Wisconsin life, we're out in the elements, we're out in the world. So there's a lot we can't control. We may have to, there's noise in the background, a plane overhead, we have to pause and wait until that's gone, and then our sound is good and we can resume. Whereas in a studio, everything's pretty much controlled. So it's much easier to produce things. So yeah, so we've had a great lineup of guests this current season, and we are generating our listing of who is to come for the second part. We tried to kind of space it out because we're trying something new. So we want to see how it went before continuing with what we think is working, and that gives us an opportunity to refine what we think is working. So we had Dr. Gloria Lansing-Billings come in and talk about CRT. And that was our first episode that we aired for this current season. And we knew that was a touchy topic for some, but we wanted to talk about it because it still remains to me a point of confusion as to why it's a touchy topic. I mean, I know why. It was put out there as like this kind of bomb that blew up. But at the end of the day, CRT is not new. It's been around, and it basically just provides a foundation, provides language for us to talk about the things that statistics are already corroborating. So why it's this volatile thing, I think, is a misnomer, and it's coming from misunderstanding, and it's used as a, political hot potato, so to speak, to be divisive, but that's not its intent. So I appreciated Dr. Lansing-Billings' perspective that she brought to that conversation, her expertise, because she's been doing this work forever, and she is definitely an expert on the topic. We also had a visual artist. I am blanking on his name. I need to pull it up. And he's a visual artist and a puppeteer who talked about art and Black joy. We talked to a realtor and a new homeowner that also as a group, we discussed home ownership and some financial literacy barriers and experiences within the Black community, as well as we had voices from higher ed, and I think that was it. I'm going down my listing. I think it was just the 4 for the first half of the second season. And like I said, we're exploring what is to come for the second part of season 2. So I think we're still, like, again, fine tuning what we're doing, who we're talking to, what we hope is resulting in, that we're not just putting things out there in the void and wishing for the best. But like I said, it's been a great experience, and yeah, I look forward to
Angela, I
doing
have a
that
question
work.
about that. I have a
Yeah.
question about your audience,
Yeah.
your audience of Why Race Matters. It seems to me that most of the people who tune in to watch that are people who are genuinely interested, people that care. And it's great because they frequently don't have any access to that kind of information. Yeah, I say that we all live in this bubble and we don't, we really don't understand what it's like for other people in our community. But I guess that's my question really is, in PBS's experience or looking at who their audience is for Why Race Matters, are you reaching people beyond those who already kind of know or are, I hate this word, who are woke? Are we reaching other people? And are you getting that kind of response from people who are really, really shocked by what they're learning or really amazed? Are you hearing that back?
So I think that to answer your question, yes, we're getting great feedback. Now, whether it's from the audience that you're describing, I think that's what we're still parsing out, because PBS Wisconsin already attracts a specific audience.
Yes.
Well, PBS in general attracts a specific audience. PBS Wisconsin attracts a specific audience. To layer that, this is a digital series. So there's that attraction to those who are consuming media through digital means versus the television. Even though we have TV specials, like we're doing an MLK special that will be televised, but the show in of itself lives online. So I think we are still understanding more fully who our audience is, as well as how we're attracting a new audience. Because I did want this to feel like it was connecting to the Black community and not just something that was an educational tool for those who are newly learning about these experiences. So it's interesting to navigate how we achieve both audiences, like connecting to both audiences. And like I said, I think we're still newly figuring that out, because that's new to PBS Wisconsin. Like, that's something I've discussed with them, like, how beyond me, like, take me out of the picture, what are you all doing to engage historically marginalized communities in your content? So I think it's been a great opportunity to stretch all of us in terms of that newness. But yeah, I'm hoping that the audience you're describing is tuning in and saying, wow, this is great, and I want to know more. And we have had folks reach out wanting to know if we had like companion learning materials or training tools they could take back to their workplaces, or instructors saying, I showed an episode of this in my class because they're talking about this topic and this helps. So we know it's getting out there. In terms of the feedback, though, we kind of anecdotally know it, and in the ways that, like, media tracks it, but some of those other pieces we don't necessarily know. So the hope is there, but like I said, we're continuing to refine, like, how best do we achieve that end goal?
That's great. That's great. And that's exactly, I like your attitude about going beyond the typical, I guess is the word I want. But here's the thing that really shocked me, and I have to tell you, I was shocked, pleased, but shocked that PBS put you on as the face of Wisconsin as you go around to all of these different communities. I mean, way up north, as we say, or places where there are no folks that look like you in their communities. And you are the host of, Discover Life in Wisconsin. What's Wisconsin like? And what it's like first is you, the face of it. And so that to me was such a big step for PBS. How do you feel? I mean, you're coming in with the camera crew and everything. Everybody's going to be real nice and everything. But what do you sense as you're going around our state? what do you sense about the reaction to you as the host?
Well, I mean, I'll say I shared your surprise as well when I was selected as a host, because this was something that the opportunity presented that I had never done before. My background is research and evaluation, and I dabbled with teaching on the side. So never did anything related to media. But when it was presented to me and I was like, sure, I'll try it out, see if it, I'll try out. And they selected me. I was like, oh, okay, let's see where this goes. So to me, it's been great. It's definitely helped me in terms of like engaging with different people, because I would say an introverted extrovert. So my default is introversion, but I've learned over the years how to turn it on when I need to. But if I'm like at home by myself or with a small group of friends, I'm good. So just being with strangers and being like engaging and all of that, that's really, I think, been a muscle I've had to build. But I will say that like the spirit that the team, the production crew, and myself bring, like we're always like having fun with our shoots, and we kind of approach it like that, as this is an opportunity to try something new, learn something new, to have fun with it, and I hope that comes across. And that does help when there are challenges. So to your point, like we're sometimes going to spaces where there is a notable lack of diversity, and the lead producer of Wisconsin Life is a Muslim young woman, and she actually goes out and scouts the locations first. So she's able to pick up on kind of the vibe of an area because she wears a hijab. So just by virtue of her wearing a hijab, she'll notice kind of how people respond to her. And that gives an indication of like, well, this is what it might be. So she gives me a heads up, like, this is what might be going on. And sometimes I approach it as a challenge, like, okay, well, we're still gonna have a good time. We're still gonna have a good interview. So it's on me to like try to get through. Because at the end of the day, we're all people, we're all human.
Yes.
So I think there's a natural opportunity for us to connect, even if like this is our first time remotely and interacting with someone that's like the other person. Because there's always a commonality that we can find. So it's just like, how do we find that commonality? How do I get that person to crack so that our humanness ultimately can connect?
That's amazing. That's amazing. When I first saw, I think the first time I met you was up at Nehemiah, up at Fountain of Life Church. And you were very, very instrumental in the beginning of Justified Anger, in putting together Black History for a New Day, which I know a number of us have attended. And the cohorts that are put together at the end of each episode of that, have been very open, and I know that Justified Anger has grown tremendously. I know, Sue Simon, you're very active up there, as well as somebody else too here is, but I'm curious about something else that you have an inside look at. We've had Karen Reese here a couple of times, but Alex G's concept of gathering together all the Black leaders in Wisconsin, many of whom had never met each other, which was amazing, and creating an upward mobility, a way, a manner in which all people of color together, we'd start with people of color, because as we found out, frequently groups like that end up with white people that think they know better and to kind of take over and what have you. But to make it a grassroots Black organization that lifts everybody and white allies. And it's eased a little bit because the allies have grown, I guess. But how, Alex G has become a spokesperson in so many ways for so many aspects of Black life in Wisconsin. Is he as joyful all the time to work with?
Well, I mean, as far as I can tell, now I'm not around Dr. G 24/7, but the moments I have got the chance to interact with him socially, like absolutely, like his demeanor and his like approach to life to me is consistent. So, and I think that bleeds into the work that he does and the way that people connect with the work.
That's great, because I see South Park Street growing in wonderful ways. Um, I know your area of education is psychology, and I know that you are currently um, on MATC's faculty, as well as um, getting a PhD. Are you working for your PhD at UW? Wow. And then you have all of these other things going on too. You have founded a group, Black Women Green Money. Uh,
Oh, wow. Yeah. I did. I've actually, it's been a few years since we've connected, just because the members of our group, we all got super busy. But our commonality was, how do we take this topic of financial literacy and make it feel relevant and accessible to communities that maybe don't feel like they have had access to the tools that the financial literacy world says this is what you need to build wealth. And I say that because I had worked for a few years, kind of coming out of that passion for financial literacy. I worked for Summit for a few years as a financial education coordinator. So I spent a lot of time in like area high schools and colleges and in community settings, talking to folks about different topics related to credit and savings and a little bit of retirement, but these were younger audiences, was more so like credit, savings, making certain purchases, like understanding car loans, stuff like that. And there are a lot of built-in assumptions around how you achieve in that world that not everyone has access to.
And that's the question. I think a lot of us, one of my first experiences with, one of my first experiences was with a neighbor of mine who was a Black woman. I said to her, how come there aren't more people, Black people at UW? And she said, well, Pat, they can't afford it. And I thought, what? And then I kept hearing things about there's no such thing as Black wealth. And so it's always been, I've always been curious. And then of course we've all learned about the redlining and the access, the non-access to mortgage funds, and what happened in 2008. So talk to us, if you can just give us kind of a little history about equity in the lives of Black folks, I would appreciate it.
What you mean as it relates to personal finance?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
sure. So I'll do my best in the absence of having like statistics in front of me right now. But I mean, we have to start, when talking about Black Americans specifically, we have to start with slavery and 400 plus years of working with no pay. So when we think about the ways in which wealth generation is set up now, it's like, oh, you work and you're investing for retirement that you can then cash out later. Well, if I'm working for multiple generations, not getting paid, not be able to put aside something to then generate wealth, that already puts me behind, right? And that's where the reparations conversation comes up for some, where it's like, oh, that's how maybe we can level the playing field a bit. But we see that hasn't really gone anywhere, even though we know that former slave owners did receive reparations for their loss in income when they no longer were able to legally have slaves. So we have, as a nation, offered reparations to different groups, but somehow it hasn't translated to like, oh, this group like worked for centuries and we didn't give them anything. Okay, so there's that piece of it. So coming out of slavery, now there's potential access to accumulate wealth. And I say with air quotes because we know that access wasn't equal. We now are entering into like segregation, Jim Crow laws, that sort of thing. And that's where we have instances or examples like redlining, where technically you are able to purchase a home, but there are these other laws in place that limit your access to being able to pursue one of the main vehicles that we as a nation are saying is something that's a centerpiece to supporting your family and having something to pass down, right? Even thinking about post-World War II GI bills, where those who fought in the war were supposed to be able to come home and access things like education, like the ability to own homes, that those benefits weren't equally dispersed based on race. So we have just kind of like layers upon layers of inequities that are ultimately having a ripple effect, right? And so we have like segregation, we have Jim Crow, we have racism in that way in terms of accessing like legit financial services. There's education, right? Education, another tool that we as a nation have positioned front and center as like, this is a vehicle through which you acquire success, you gain a career, you can use this to build wealth. Well, who's able to go to college? Everyone wasn't able to go to college at one point in time. And so that's what contributed to the development, the start of historically Black colleges and universities. When there was discrimination and outright non-admittance of people based on race, these other institutions were developed. Some private, some publicly funded. But when we look at the data, we're able to see that even as of today, there's a clear disparity in the funding afforded to public HBCUs versus public predominantly white institutions. Clearly, the federal government and state governments have not equally invested in these institutions. So not only are HBCUs serving an underserved community that historically has not been able to generate the resources to go to college, they're also not being funded in the same ways to support that student group. Yet these institutions are producing the highest number of Black doctors, Black lawyers, like other professionals that are directly contributing to our society, right? And so like the numbers keep going like on and on, because if we go on the back end of education in terms of who's equally benefiting, we know there's discrimination in terms of access to employment. We know there's disparities in terms of who's being predominantly impacted by student loan debt. So it just, like, it's so compounded in terms of this whole wealth piece. And more newly, what has been coming across like my social media feeds in like the past year, which isn't surprising, right? Because we know how racism works and how it's so deeply rooted. But even if you're someone who was able to overcome the odds and achieve things that maybe you had barriers to achieving, like home ownership, you are less likely to have a home that is valued at the same as your white counterparts. When we talk about equity, you know, we use home equity in loads of different ways to start businesses, to help our children. But if I have less equity by virtue of me being a Black person, and they had examples of how this played out, where they had a Black family that was getting their house evaluated, and they like basically put in some white friends of theirs to pretend like they were the homeowners, and the assessment came up way higher than what it originally. Yep. Same house, just different face of who owned the home, right? That impacts it on the back end, what I have wealth-wise. So all of these things, right, have an impact on how we navigate financial spaces and who has access to what. So the starting point was never equal, and then it was never made equal. And then there's continued to remain barriers to achieving what we're told is success. So like I said, people are still working their way through, because that's life, right? We can't just kind of sit back and like, well, I mean, guess we could sit back and just be defeated. But I will say that's not in me. I don't think that's in my community to just be like, oh, well, I can't do anything about it. No, we work with what we can. But for me, as someone who is professionally in that space, I try to be very sensitive to when I'm talking to people to not make assumptions about who can do what. Like, I know one of the common things that sometimes when talking to potential new homeowners is to assume that they can go to their parents for help with the down payment. Not everyone has access to parents who can just give them $20,000 or however much to cover the 20% or less down payment they need. And then what does that mean if they're trying to, again, navigate that space of trying to acquire something that could be the starting point of wealth generation for their family and generations to come. So trying to meet people where they are and helping this topic not feel so insurmountable, or that I have to have a 6-figure plus income to even start the conversation. It's like, no, you can start where you are and build. It may take you longer. It may require more creativity, which is why I think a lot of communities of color a lot of times default to entrepreneurship as a means to success, because other channels that are more traditional have so many barriers. So rather than having to go to college and do all these things, let me just start my own. And that can be the way that I'm good from a financial standpoint. But yeah, it has been like super interesting, just even professionally being in that space and challenging, or having like challenging conversations with my colleagues about when we're going into MMSD high schools, for example, because our high schools are so diverse. We have to be sensitive to how we're talking about these things with our students. Like, for example, when I would talk about college and paying for college, I can't assume that the students that I'm talking to at East can all access federal student loans if they're undocumented, for example. So what's your pathway to college? How does it look like for you? I get that you want to go, and I encourage you to. your path is just going to look different. And I shouldn't speak to you as though it's the same as it would be for everyone else. So yeah, I'm someone who's super passionate about it because I'm figuring it out myself and I've achieved some success. So I'm like, here guys, this is what I've learned. How can we all continue to learn together to get at that place where we can maybe do some things collectively to really bring about change.
Why it's so important to hear these words, because, you know, I think we all just take it for granted. Oh yeah, I mean, what's easy for us must be the same for everybody. And I know it's been shocking to me over and over to see the depth of 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 poverty over and over. You know, no way to get out, no way to quote pull yourselves up. You know, this without help, and then being castigated for taking advantage of things that are made available. It's like there's no way out. And so it delights me, and I'm sure everybody feels the same way, to know that there are young professional people that don't look like us in Madison that are kind of, you know, shaking the trees to make things happen. I know all of us who are here this morning, beyond voting for things that can make things better, look for ways to change the situation. And I think the saddest thing is that we begin to realize that it just isn't going to happen overnight. We had Sabrina Madison come and speak some time ago. Part of one of the things that she does is she has a group to teach financial literacy to a lot of women who are in poverty. But she insists that those women bring their children with them to hear, because that's how it has to happen. So why race matters? I would love to see it televised rather than just being virtual. I would love to see it televised. How can we go about making things like that happen? Writing letters, phone calls? How does that happen?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to reach out to the network to encourage, to say like there's a desire to see this program beyond the internet, then yeah, absolutely, that's a starting point. I honestly can't even say what the rationale was behind it being a digital series versus not. So there may be some other reasons that I just don't know about, but I think that the simple advocacy could lend to that changing, or maybe some opportunities for the show to be shown, you know, during some periods of time on TV.
Good. Well, I know you do so many different things, as I said, kind of the yin and the yang kinds of things. So we're just so pleased to have you here. Are you, what are your plans to grow in your profession?
Oh, wow. I'm honestly still figuring that out, because I've done so many different things. I'm kind of like, I could do anything. So I'm trying to see organically where things go. But as you mentioned, I'm in school, so I would like to finish that milestone, and I can see remaining in the higher ed world. In terms of what that means exactly, that's what I'm trying to figure out, because I work professionally in the 2-year space while going to school in a 4-year setting. So I appreciate both, but I also have a really soft spot for community colleges because of the access they give to as a start to higher education for anyone who wants it. I know at times they're seen as less prestigious than a 4-year, but I feel like community colleges are really about equity work and just their existence. So I think continuing in that vein would make so much sense for me, and hopefully the PhD will help me to continue to grow in that particular setting.
Great. Sue, go, please.
Yeah, can I ask you, Angela, having been here for 7 or 8 years and coming from a community which is much more comfortable for you, have you seen any growth in Madison in the time you've been here? Or are you ready, like many before you have said, they're ready to cut and run?
That's a good question. I feel like there has been, I know, Pat, you mentioned like Park Street, like there's been development on Park Street, like at Madison College campus I work at is on Park Street. I'm at the Goodman South campus, so I see that like every day when I go to work. But I'm also cautious about the gentrification that will naturally follow, because we see the condos and different things being built kind of closer to campus, and how I think there's eventually going to be a creep down. So my hope is that as development takes place, those who are in the community are able to remain and benefit and aren't pushed out. But I think for me, I've definitely been able to become a part of the community. That did take some work to find the community, like where to go, who to meet, all of that. It was kind of like a scavenger hunt my first couple of months here, but now I'm like settled and all of that. And Madison does feel like home. I mean, I go home and I miss aspects of home, and I'm also like, okay, I'm ready to go back. So I appreciate it, and that's surprising because I did have a 2-year plan that I was going to be here for 2 years, and then I was going to go to the West Coast, because I had never lived there. So I just wanted to kind of see what it would be like to be out in California. And maybe I'll end up there eventually. But I mean, I see progression. What feels most promising to me is the time I spend in our schools, because there's such a distinction between like the community that I see sometimes out in Madison and the community that I see in the K-12 space, because our schools are way more diverse than I think Madison looks sometimes on the surface. And so I hope that these kids that are coming up, that are sometimes born and raised here, that they see Madison as home and are able to like be supported in investing and becoming a part of Madison versus feeling the opposite and leaving, because that would be a huge disservice for Madison to not feel like a place that can retain its own.
Right.
So that's kind of TBD a little bit, but that's what's exciting to me, to see the younger generation look, I think, a lot more diverse than maybe previous generations have. And I think it's to be determined what we do with them and how we value them.
Wow, that's encouraging. That's encouraging.
It is encouraging.
Anybody else have questions for Angela? Jen,
What have I learned?
let's see.
Oh, I say Genevieve put like a dissertation question in the chat.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about how bad it is and that it's worse than other places. And I remember the first time I read about this maternity issue, and I was just horrified that, no matter how well off the African-American woman was, she still fit in that statistic. And because we think of it as, well, it's everybody in poverty, that's really the problem, but the statistics don't show that. So so anyway, so what have you learned about why? Because I thought, I moved here from Richmond, Virginia, where you have been for a while. So, the feeling that, I mean, I can remember telling people, in Richmond, I was a bleeding heart liberal, but in Madison, I'm a moderate. So why is this liberal place of Madison so bad?
I mean, that's a great question. I don't know if we have that specific of an answer. So I'm like, well, that's a dissertation question. I've heard some theories about why potentially, because like you said, the infant mortality, maternal health issue is not Madison specific, right? That's everywhere. It's just Madison is worse off than some other places. And that raises the question, like, what is it, kind of like to your point, what is it about Madison? So I guess 2 theories that I've heard, one being that statistically, different communities of color are so small that it can be easy for some of these challenges to fly under the radar and not be as directly addressed compared to if we made up like 20%, 30%, 40% of the population, right? Because I'm in other studies where I'm looking at numbers where the percentage is so small, it's hard to sometimes for those issues to demand as much attention as they should, right? So I think that may be a part of it. But then also, what I've been told is, so Wisconsin has this, how do I say it? Like there's something unique about kind of the culture of the Midwest. Because we mentioned the Midwest, nice, but there's also this ingrained, like kind of grit, for lack of a better term, that I think what Westerners in general have. Like you work hard, you succeed by working hard. Like we're not like those people over there that everything is handed to them. Like we work. So I think, and that makes sense. You think about like the elements here, the cold environment that people still farm and do things through. And I'm like, wow, you're biking in that? That's determination, right? So there's just something about, I think, the Midwest spirit of like hardworking and determination that we attach to individual behavior and outcomes that generate from those behaviors, that it might be easy to minimize the systemic external stuff that also influences people. Not to negate individuals' responsibility for their own life outcomes, right? We get that. Yes, everyone should make the right choices, et cetera, et cetera. But we have to talk about the other things that influence individuals' behavior and how they navigate systems and structures and spaces. And I don't know if that mentality of, I do this, so this is what results, allows for that larger conversation to happen as easily. So yeah, that's just theories that I've heard, but it would be great to try to get at that a little bit more, to know specifically what is it, and then what do we need to do about it. Because as it relates to the health topic, I've read things that talk about, okay, well, the issue is that, you know, Black women aren't believed as much by the healthcare professionals that they seek. So if they're in pain or if they're having a challenge, they're not believed. And if they're not believed, that challenge could be exacerbated, could lead to something like life-threatening. Okay, how could we address that? More cultural sensitivity, but also more representation on behalf of healthcare professionals. Okay, but does that really solve the root of the issue to produce those sort of like solutions? Not necessarily, right? And where does Wisconsin specific stuff situate itself in like that sort of conversation? I mean, I would love to know. I don't know, but like I said, if anyone is interested in a PhD, I feel like that'd be a great study to try to answer. And then I think that would be like award winning, because it would help with so much of what we're trying to figure out.
Jen.
I've come to know that the infant and maternal mortality rate is also very high, disproportionately high among Native Americans. And I have the impression that they may have their own ways of dealing with childbirth. Mm-hmm. And you bring in a white doctor who has, you know, a whole different attitude as to what needs to happen, and they're not believed. And so I think, you know, stress, I think I heard, was one of the things considered as a contributing factor, you know, in mortality. And how distressing that is. You know, how do we get, you know, straight arrow, dyed in the wool, you know, white doctors to have a higher regard for women of color, different races, whatever, and their attitudes, you know, their beliefs as to how things should feel or go or whatever. So I'm sure as women, we would all love to see that solutions, you know, achieved. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that stress is a huge underlying factor as to health risks for many, if not all, historically marginalized communities. And then we have healthcare professionals who aren't taught in ways that maybe align with like cultural practices. So there's that disconnect, as well as the fact that, like, are we being taught things that really understand the nuances of the healthcare needs of this particular group? Because thinking about like women's health, there are things that women deal with. The healthcare community is like, oh, we don't know anything about that. Because why would we study that? You're not a guy. That's what we care about. Like our basis for understanding healthcare needs starts with men. I use an example of like fibroids. Like fibroids are something that impacts many women, disproportionately impacts, you know, women of certain communities, but there's very little that we know about fibroids. Why is that? Why is that certain health conditions get much less attention than others in terms of our levels of understanding? So yeah, it's like the system is not really set up for supporting different groups, and then the groups themselves have higher health risks. So that seems like a recipe for non-success in the space you're talking about.
Well, you know, the fact that, number one, the fact that you're on television just opens up people's eyes to maybe ask these questions. And I think that's where sometimes it has to begin. We have to ask these questions. We've had a number of folks speak to us, older folks, older people, older men and women. How's that? And I see that there are a number of people from different communities who are now entering politics or trying to represent their communities. That gives me a great deal of hope. But you mentioned the young people that you see in the K through 12 education system here in Madison. And I wonder, because I too have been into the schools, and what I see is lots of diversity, but within that diversity, very distinct groups of people. And who's, we've found out the hard way, all of us, that people like to be with people like themselves. So it's not surprising that the lunch tables are, racially divided. But how do we convert that physical diversity of people into a more emotional intertwining of peoples? How do we go about that? I think so many of us we're trying to learn so that we can have respect and affirmation of differences, but it's like shaking the tree and not having any apples fall down. We don't know how to make it happen. And our frustration, I'm sure, is nothing compared to yours. But if you ever have any ideas about how to go about helping people just on I guess it's a one-on-one basis, isn't it, to make those things happen? So that's where I am, and I kind of think I speak for a lot of us. Yes, Nan Youngerman.
Well, I'm just listening, and I want to say just a huge meta thank you, because you have been so articulate and so honest and just really superb. And I just wanted to say, as I'm watching the minutes on the clock tick by, going forward, please remember this group. And if there's something that hits your mind that you think you might reach back to us and that we could put some power, like you mentioned, hey, write letters to the editor or to the TV station or whatever. But as you leave us, if other things come to your mind, I guess we'll appoint Pat as our spokesperson, but touch back with us, please, because you are a gift to this community. And we thank you for, just investing now, 7 years of your life and leaving behind. I have kids who live in Brooklyn, and you walk out the door and you see generations of people who are living as you describe, and how do we inch forward here? So that's my piece.
Thank you, and absolutely will.
And if there's nobody else who has questions or comments, then I will say to you, Angela, I couldn't have put it better than Nan did. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being so open with us. We appreciate you.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate the invitation. Happy to connect with you all anytime.
And we will keep in touch with you and follow you, see where you're going.
All right, sounds like a plan. Thank you all. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Oh my goodness. So